Hi guys, thank you for tuning into GNG live segment. Today, Gail and I have a special guest that we've invited back, Tammy. Tammy was one of our first guests, and she's back for another discussion on a really, really great topic that actually me and Tammy were offline chatting about. And it's about hiring. We've seen so let's be real. We've seen so many companies have hired a lot of Black people due to the whole recent events, not recent, sorry, back in June or May, George Floyd movement started, and then the Black Lives movement has been happening for many, many years, but everyone started talking about it. Then we've seen this whole trend where companies just started hiring Black people. And so me and Tammy have talked about this offline, but you're not really solving the problem, are you? So we're here. I'm gonna let Tammy lead this conversation. Guys, just a disclaimer: we're having an open discussion, so no hate speech here. Do not write hateful comments. Yeah, we encourage you to join the conversation, but we're not here trying to debate or argue that Black people shouldn't be hired. So what we're trying to get in the heart of is the real problem in organizations that go beyond just hiring Black people. Just because you hired a Black person doesn't mean you've actually fixed the problem, which is happening in so many organizations. The hiring colored people is not fixing the problem. Let's fix the problem. So just a disclaimer about that. But Tammy, let's dive right in about which me and you've been talking about offline. Hiring Black people is not really fixing the problem.
I think Tammy's having some troubles connecting.
Yeah, I can't hear you echoing. Gail, can you say something?
I can hear you both. There's some fuzziness going on.
Yeah, there is some fuzziness going on.
Like there's some feedback.
Yeah.
Let me out and come back in and see if that helps.
Okay. Are we live though?
Oh, we're live. So why don't you talk before Tammy comes back, because this came from a conversation between the two of you offline. And this is an important conversation. So why don't you give the audience a little bit of context, a little bit of what were you talking about with her that drove you to want to bring this out to the broader conversation?
So we were talking about how we're seeing so companies are hiring. So companies started hiring Black people. But the real issue is, well, how many companies are actually fixing the problem? Like, by hiring a Black person doesn't mean you fix the problem, right? So that's what we're talking about. And we also dived into, but how many other biases are you creating by hiring a Black person, right? I'm not saying don't hire Black people. I'm saying, but to get on a bandwagon trend, to come across as a company that's saying Black Lives Matter, and we're gonna hire one Black person, well, we solved the problem. But that's not really solving the problem, because if you talk about this, Gail, if you hire Black people, colored people, but then you're not including them in, you're not growing them, they don't have a voice, their opinions don't matter. Just because you gave them a seat on the table, you think you fixed the problem, right? But have you fixed the problem? Because I don't think companies have actually fixed the problem.
Yeah. So Tammy, will you start for us if you can hear me? You can hear me, Tammy?
I can.
Okay. So why don't we start with the problem itself? Because I think it's helpful for people to understand what is the issue in organizations prior to hiring a Black person, that hiring them won't solve the issue. So can we start with that?
So I think for me, the problem is, and part of this is our fault, right? We have for a long time accepted the Black diversity officer in chief or the brown one, and we have said that that's enough. We don't need anything else. They at least have a Black person in that role. They at least have a brown person in that role, and then we have kind of walked away. I like it too. I don't know if you guys remember when Obama was running for president. He said, "Listen,
can't hear you,
getting me in." And then the second half is, you guys have to still show up. You have
Gil, can you hear me?
Don't be
I can.
Okay.
You guys can hear me?
I can hear you, but Gurpreet cannot.
So continue. Continue. It's fine.
No, I don't know what's going on. It's like I'm echoing and you guys are echoing.
Let me see if I can hear you on Facebook or LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm curious if she can be heard on LinkedIn, because really it's we want the audience to hear what she has to say. I mean, this is really.
Yeah. You guys can hear me? I'm going to go out.
I can hear you, but Gurpreet cannot.
Okay, so it's the same noise on LinkedIn. This is let me try.
I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, no. Okay, so she left. Same problem is happening on LinkedIn. Can't hear on LinkedIn either.
Okay. So there's some sort of issue with her connection.
Yeah.
So if you want, do you want to continue where she was talking? She was talking about the problem, about what the issue is prior to even hiring a Black person. Yeah.
So Gil, both me and you've openly talked about this issue is first, before you go hire a Black person or any color person, if you really want to fix the problem, you're going to need to first take a hard look at your organization, right?
Oh, that's better.
Hey, now we can hear you. No fuzziness. That's the Tammy we love.
Tammy was having some technical difficulties, so we're going to start the conversation again. So Tammy, take it away. Take it away. Take it away.
So before I got cut off here, I was saying that I think the problem is we are part of the problem, because I think what we have accepted as a society, and it just kind of as people that care about this issue, is we just accepted that they put a Black person in the role. We just accepted that they put a brown person in the role. And then everybody walked away from it, right? What I was saying is, I remember when Obama was running for president and he was doing his speeches, and he said, listen, like, the first part of the job is to get me here. The second part of the job is I need the constituents to still be engaged in the change that they want to see. So what happens is sometimes as an organization, we require some change, and that may become in the form of diversity and inclusion, but then we go away. So from a management perspective, they've done the first part of the job, but the rest of us aren't engaged enough to say, okay, now that you've hired a Black or brown person, let's talk about the changes we really do want to see in the company. Let's talk about how we can help that D&I manager really push change through. So that poor person comes in and they're left alone. They're left alone in this role with no power and no help from employees and lower level managers to really make change that's necessary in an organization. And me personally, I don't think just hiring somebody who's Black or brown really is the case, because there's a lot of white employees, there's a lot of Hispanic employees that are very well versed on the issues of diversity and inclusion. And in the same way that Black people have been excluded from roles because we are assumed to not know enough or not be educated enough, aren't we doing the same thing when we say only somebody Black or brown can do this role, when there's probably white employees that can do this role just as well?
Yeah,
absolutely. One of the problems that I've seen with companies over the last 20 years throughout my career, that there's been always this push for diversity through my career. But the problem is that push for diversity predated the push for inclusion and equity.
Right.
And from the conversations that I've had with Black people and people of color, that oftentimes what happens, whereas there's push for diversity, but then when the person is brought on, it actually, the opposite of solves the problem. You're actually creating a bigger problem for the individual.
Right.
For a variety of reasons, whether they're perceived have gotten the job because of the color of their skin, or because of they're not included because of the color of their skin.
Yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about that and about the impact that this push for diversity prior to inclusion has caused?
Well, that's exactly one of the impact is you're creating another race animosity within your organization, right? because no Black person wants to be perceived of having gotten the job simply because they're Black, right? Because if you just install me because I'm Black, I'm already undermined before I even start doing any kind of work. Nobody's going to take my role or my abilities seriously, right? And so for Black employees, a lot of times the way Black employees view sometimes these Black hires is just another Black person set in place to enforce white rule and standard. And so this is why you can't do identity politics, especially for this role, because you're going to have white employees and brown employees saying, well, why do we have to listen to her? We know she only got the job because she's Black. Does she even really know what she's doing or he's doing? And then there's going to be Black people in your organization saying, well, they're not really here to make any changes. They're here to safeguard and enforce the current standard, what's already happening in the organization. And so until you get to the place of inclusion, where the Black person you're bringing in, or the brown person you're bringing in, or even the white person that's going to be doing this role is really advocating inclusion into decision-making, inclusion into the hiring and firing of certain employees as they come in an organization, you can hire for diversity, and that's going to look good. But I personally have seen that companies do racial hire for cover. It's really why they do it. So that if they ever do get called on being not diverse enough or not inclusive, they can then say, well, what do you mean? Gurpreet is our D&I person. She's a person of color. How could you say we're not a company that cares about this? And so a lot of times these hires are nothing more than covers for organizations that aren't really serious about diversity and inclusion.
So I want to add there, like what you said earlier, which me and you were talking about, you're hiring people, but then you're only hiring Black people right now to save face, okay? But unknowingly, you're creating a whole different bias for everybody else, all the other kind of people, white people, everyone included.
Right.
Because now you just said, we're only going to hire this person for this role, but it has to be Black, right? So what about me? I'm a color person. I'm same limitations as Black people. Maybe Black people are more, but this is not a race about who has more. But if you, as an organization, want to limit, really get rid of bias, then you need to take a break, put a stop on the brakes, and ask yourself, well, wait, how are we going to fix the problem?
Right.
By hiring a Black person, you're not fixing the problem. You're just creating more and more biases against all the other races, which to me is not fair. So I know some people may not like what I'm saying because I'm brown, but this isn't a division. Racism happens to so many of us.
Right.
For so many different reasons.
Right. Well, I know a lot of Black people that don't like brown people.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I mean? I know a lot of brown people that this idea that racism only exists in the vacuum of Black and white really speaks to sometimes white people's ignorance about racism, because there's racism between Black and brown people. There's racism between Black and white people, white and brown people. It's not just exclusive to Black and white, you know, to your point. If you're a brown person, and all of this really depends on, additionally, it depends on where you are in the country, right? So I was a nurse recruiter for a very, very long time. And most of the nurses that we recruited were Indian nurses and Filipino nurses. Texas has a really high population, a really high concentrated Indian population, right? And I will tell you personally that my nurses experienced a lot of racism from both spectrums. They experienced it from white people and they experienced it from Black people. Why? White people just didn't like anybody. I mean, some of them don't like anybody that's not white. And a lot of Black people saw brown people, particularly Indian people, coming in and taking jobs away from them because, one, they were immigrants. And so maybe they would take less money in terms of pay. They were immigrants, so they would put up with a lot more workplace abuse than maybe a Black American would. And so my nurses were dealing with the clashes of both white people and Black people. So this idea that the only people that can do diversity and inclusion is just a Black person is a bit naive and laughable, to be honest. I think any person well versed in the issues and that care about diversity and inclusion, I think any person of any race can do the role.
So there's an interesting question here about, please talk about inclusion roles. There are some top chief inclusion roles that have started coming up this year in 2020. So can you talk a little bit about those roles and how you see they can be done effectively? Because as you're saying, it, regardless of who's in the role, because if they have the knowledge, if they have the passion, if they have the caring, if they have the capability, it doesn't matter who they are, and isn't that ultimately what diversity is all about, right? It's about really trying to get to a meritocracy. So what's some of the best you've seen in those roles? What are some of the things that you've seen that organizations have been successful in sort of bridging the gap between, you know, basically white supremacy and a better world?
I will say organizations that aren't afraid to be uncomfortable. And I think that's what stops a lot of progress for managers in these roles, is that the minute the tough conversations are being had and people get uncomfortable and they start leading from emotion and not from having a fact-based discussion about what the numbers are, what the realities are, and taking out people's emotions, then it's hard for anybody to be effective in this role. So if you are going to be, if you're considering taking this role, and if you're considering hiring somebody for this role, you have to be okay with the uncomfortable conversations that's probably going to upset some employees, that some employees are not going to like, that some employees are going to go into the HR and complain about. But that's what stops conversation. So if Gil and I are having a conversation, we're talking about Black-white issues, or we're in a group setting, and I say something that he deems as racial, or if he feels like I'm pigeonholing white people, and that upsets him, and then he shuts down conversation, and then the conversation ends, then nobody's going to be effective in that role. And I think diversity managers have to decide that when they're doing this work, that they're going to upset people, that they're going to make people uncomfortable, but they still have to do it anyway. And they have to have the backing from leadership that this is what's going to happen.
How often do you see that happening, though? Because that's a difficult thing, right? We're in this situation because leaders didn't really care beforehand, and they didn't have any backing behind DE&I activities, right?
Leaders actually still don't care. And from what I've seen, we had one company reach out to us and got on the call with the CEO. I thought for sure this was like the best conversation I'd ever had with the CEO around diversity and inclusion. And he talked about wanting his team to have fearless conversations no matter where they fell on the issue of race. He wanted everybody to come in and have fearless conversation. But here's the kicker. The CEO himself wasn't ready to have a fearless conversation about race. So if you aren't ready to have a fearless conversation about race, how do you invite me in to have a fearless conversation with your employees? That doesn't work. And so we don't see it working because a lot of people aren't ready to have the fearless conversation. And that has to start from your leadership. You and I talk all the time, Gilla, and I've said to you, for me, culture and D&I are not two separate things. Culture is global and D&I is local. It's local to your culture. And if you have an overall great culture that invites conversation, that creates room to have tough conversation, you can have real conversations about D&I. You can talk about where your company falls down in diversity. You can talk about where your company falls down in inclusion. But if you don't have a culture that invites that conversation, then you're going to bring in people that's going to do D&I initiatives. So I'm going to give you tasks to do, and employees are going to do the tasks, right? Because you invited a consultant in, we've paid for this training. So your employees are going to show up to that training and they're going to do the tasks. But if the culture isn't set that, okay, we feel safe to have conversations about race, gender, sexuality, that most companies don't feel safe to do, then I mean, you can hire people and I can come in and do some initiatives for you, but it's not going to be a change that's sustainable for your organization because the culture isn't designed for that kind of change.
So how do they move along that spectrum? How do they get closer to that, right? Because if they're not ready for the difficult conversations, but ultimately this is where the world should be moving, and these are ultimately conversations that we need to have. How do you help a company do that? How do you help a leader understand that first you need to crawl before you walk, before you run, that you first need to have a difficult conversation about something maybe not necessarily so contentious, but still a difficult conversation? Normalize that. So how do you go about doing that?
So for me, I first start with, and this is a Gurpreet thing because this is her wheelhouse. I first look at what your hiring practices are. What measures to hire? How are you finding candidates? How are you making that decision about who comes in your organization and what role they're going to play? Because it's funny because companies will go to the tough conversation, they'll go to the culture thing, but they haven't really addressed their hiring. Because if you haven't figured out how you're bringing people into your organization and what that, which is your thing, Gil, what that employee experience looks like from the beginning of coming into your organization to now we're talking about D&I and inclusion and how we work that, and now we're building you into our culture, then you're just bringing people on and it becomes disjointed. So the first thing I ask companies, tell me about your hiring process. How are you finding your candidates? How are you making that selection? And once we have an idea about what that hiring looks like, okay, what is your company ethos? What do you want for your organization? What do you want for your employees? What do you want your company to look like? And when I say that, I'm not just talking about what your diversity looks like how how many Black people you have in this role, how many Spanish people you have here, Indian, white. I'm talking about overall, regardless of who's in your organization, what do you want it to look like? What do you want people to feel when they walk into your organization? Mm-hmm. And I find that most companies have no idea. They haven't even answered that question. So the first thing is, what do you want your company to look like? What do you want your employees to feel when they walk in? And then once we know what that is, then we can start having conversations around what it is they want that they may not have in their organization.
But even we got to dive deeper than that. Your hiring team, your hiring managers, if they're biased,
yes,
they're going to hire bias. For example, I have an MBA. I only want MBA people now. I've seen small little biases happen all the time. MBA, I want MBA. And that's it. Then it's all candidates. That's it. If you don't have MBA, I don't want to look at you because I have an MBA. So I want the same, right? So these biases. So before you go, so I like what diversity, inclusion, these roles are popping trend. We see it all.
Yeah.
And I'm not a trend person. I just laugh when I see these things because it's like, what are you doing? I'm an HR person. I've seen so many trends. Then we had the chief of people. Yeah. It was all people. Then it was that trend. Then it became culture. Then it was that trend. It's always a trend. But I think companies to stop trends, but really address the issue. You can't address biases by hiring colored people and think you've done the job. You need to address the problem inside. If you have biased people in your organization, well, time to say bye to them, because that's the only way change can happen into your organization.
Now, most people aren't honest about their bias, though. That's the problem.
Yes, you can see it. Like some companies will keep on keeping dead weight in their company. If you have biased people in your company, hiring a Black person to work under that person is not solving the problem.
Yeah. Makes it worse, actually.
It's worse. You are putting them in a situation that is not in their favor because you have a biased person that doesn't like Black people. And now you just made them report to them.
Yes.
How is that?
I did a post on, I don't remember what day, but I talked about this very fact about, Gil, you and I talked about it. I'm trying to think of the company that said that Wells Fargo, where he said that he was having problem that the pool of Black talent was limited. And I was like, I guarantee you that's not why he hasn't had the ability to hire Black people. And
No.
I talked about being a director, both responsible for hiring people and being a job seeker, that when I was a director, I'm a Black woman. So when I had employees walk in, I was naturally drawn to Black women. That's because I'm a Black woman. That's just what it is. I was naturally drawn to the Black candidates. If we shared anything in common, I liked them a little bit more. If we had cultural background, if they were Caribbean in some way, I liked them even more. So I found things first identifying with race. We all do it. And this idea that we don't do it is just insane. And I think people aren't honest about that. So if I did that as a Black director and I had a manager, my manager who reported to me was Hispanic. When Hispanic employees, candidates applied, she naturally was drawn to Hispanic candidates. My white managers did the same. But what we would then go back, we would then sit down and look at all the candidates. We were always open about, well, I like this one. And she would say, why? Because she's Black. And I would do one of these. And she'd say, I like this one. And I'm like, why? Because she's Spanish. And then we would literally start going through those candidates really based on, is this person going to be the best one for the job? And do they qualify? And we were okay having that conversation and saying, well, I like the candidate because she was Black and she just seemed like a girl I would know. And you liked the Spanish girl because she seemed like a girl you would know. But now let's talk about who really has the qualifications for the job. And I feel like a lot of times hiring managers don't have somebody sitting down for them to really bounce that off and have an honest conversation about why you like that candidate. If you're a Black guy and you're going into corporate America in the Wells Fargo situation, you're probably interviewing with a bunch of other white guys.
Yeah.
You're a Black guy that don't golf, you don't ski, your wife don't have 3.5 kids. You're not driving a Jaguar. So you're already at a disadvantage because you don't share the same race, right? So strike that. So there's no advantage there. You don't share the same culture, strike that. And now you have nothing in common with these people. Now,
No.
do you think that white guy is going to say, I really liked, Ted. He seemed like a nice guy. Or are they gonna like Gil? Gil walks in and he's another white guy. And they went maybe to the same school, right? Maybe they went to the same college. So now you got that in common. And Gil loves golfing and they talk about golfing. You put these same two candidates in front of a boardroom of white guys. Who do those white guys are going to feel like they knew more in that interview? They're going to feel like they knew Gil more. Although they probably didn't ask Gil any more questions than they asked the Black guy. It's just that idea of being familiar. And so I think we need to about bias.
There's a couple of things I want to highlight, though, about what you're talking about. Because first of all, you're talking about bias, and the fact of the matter is you recognized your own biases.
Yeah.
You surfaced your own biases. And the reality is that I think there's a misconception that once you think about these biases, that they just go away. It's not true. It just isn't going to happen. We all have biases, and that's part of the difficult conversations. So you were having these conversations with your ex-boss, and it was a difficult conversation made better by the relationship you had and by the work you did to build that. But it's still saying, hey, look, you like that person because you're calling out each other's biases.
Right.
You're able to have that conversation to say, look, they exist. I'm not mad at you for being like that.
Right.
I'm not calling you racist because you like the Black person more than you like the white person. I'm just saying, be aware of what your gut is telling you, why it's telling you that. Have somebody to call you out, which is the culture and the behavior that you need, because that's the behavior that will then keep you from hiring biased. Because if you just say, I liked this person and they have me Black and there's nobody else saying, Tammy, you know what, this is probably why, let's dive deeper. You're going to make the hiring. And what percentage of hiring managers honestly make hiring decisions from their gut? It's a scary, scary number.
It is.
I want to go back to bouncing, sitting down and bouncing it, walking through the hiring decisions as a team. It should be a team effort. It shouldn't just be one person's opinion. And the reason I like that is you're right, because I've seen this happen so many times. So when I, as an HR person, every company I've worked for, even now being a consultant, I do this practice, is the why. Why you want to hire this person. So for example, the biggest discrimination I've seen happen, everyone gets discriminated. Let me clear this out, okay? I don't care what your color, your color skin is. There's so many discriminations happening in hiring all the time. But there needs to be somebody that's strong enough to ask why. Why do you want to hire this person? Why not this candidate? So when you do the why, you forget the color, you forget everything. You just start to really hound out, okay, well, this one. And then me, if I'm part of the hiring, which I am an HR, I've also interviewed candidates, and I actually sit in with my hiring managers. I don't let the hiring manager just do the interview by himself.
Right.
I let the time, because best practice.
Right.
Again, to sound off, right? And for example, so I'm going to give two examples here. One is, I remember one of my clients saying, I don't want an immigrant, no new immigrant. I said, why? And he couldn't give me any good reason. I'm like, okay, but let's look at why not. Sure, give me all the reasons you think you shouldn't, but let's also explore the reasons you should. There's two different sides to the story. Technically, all it came down to was just that little fear of maybe they can't speak proper English, or they don't know the culture. I'm like, oh, we can train all that. This is whatever, easy. Okay, no problem. Hiring new immigrants became not a problem. It was like, okay, let's do it, right? So my last client I was working with last year, I loved what the VP said. So this was an organization that had a problem, not problem, but they felt like they didn't look diverse. So they had more brown people, more colored people. Sorry, they had more colored people working in the organization, which will happen in small organizations that are run by colored people. You will have colored people because you understand the biases that happen, but it had nothing to do with that. So the VP was so frustrated. He came to me and said he was so frustrated. He's like, I'm tired. Like the CEO is telling me to hire white people because we don't have enough white people. So we have a lot of colored people. He goes, I don't want to discriminate. I look at the candidate. I don't care your color. I don't care what religion you are, race, color. None of that stuff matters to me. For my team, it's about, okay, we need engineers. I look at qualification, your experience, and what we can do. Can you do the job? Yes, you're hired. But now he was being forced to discriminate, and he was having such a hard time. And he got to the point where he just didn't care. He hired the best person, ended up being a colored person. And he goes, I don't care. He goes, because in the end of the day, we should be hiring for the right person to do the job. It doesn't matter.
A lot of white people applying.
We did. Like, well, I can only talk about because we were hiring for project manager, right? So we had all these diverse candidates, but in the end of the day, the best candidate that we all saw, like I was part of it, was this colored person. So now we're supposed to discriminate?
Right.
And this is why we're talking about this, is unknowingly you are creating biases when you say you want a particular race or particular color person, because right now we have that big movement going on for months. And I also we were talking about this because I remember I said to you, I saw this post, which I didn't want to, like, I just keep quiet, but I don't agree with a lot of things happening. So this one person, I came across a post, they're not connected to me, but they wrote that companies need to hire more Black people in C-levels, right? So that was one that really like stuck out to me, is like, but what about all the other colored people? Because in bigger organization, you're talking about Wells Fargo, banks, white.
Yeah.
We have that issue We have that issue in so many big organizations, multi-million organizations, where the C-level board people are white. So why should we say Black? Why don't we say, hey, diversify, hire diversity so that it looks inclusive? I know as a colored person, if I'm walking into a room when I was a candidate and it was all white people interviewing me, you know, the first thing, and I'm born and raised in Canada. Yeah, I faced racism. Maybe not too extreme like my dad did when he came, but still I did. I used to crunch and like, they're not gonna like me, I'm brown. That is the first thing that used to come to my mind. If I walked in to an interview, it's all white people, I'm like, oh, I'm already ruled out. But I shouldn't have to feel like that. I shouldn't, as a candidate, ever feel like that. You know what? That's one thing I always did, because I know how it feels as an HR person. I always made sure that there was no biases from me happening. Always try to make candidates welcome. I don't care what color your skin is. And then the same thing I try to do with the hiring managers is, you know, you got to create that welcome space. Hence why I sat with a manager, because a white, a brown, little bit, you know, kind of like create that environment so that someone coming in doesn't feel like, same thing for a white person, them coming in and seeing colored people. I don't want them to feel like, oh shit, they're not going to hire me because I'm not brown.
I don't need this demographic in this company.
Yeah, same thing. And that does happen. Hence why we're saying, you know, biases happen to all of us. Biases happen to all of us, regardless of the color of our skin. Education biases happen. You know, you may have a disability. I've seen that happen. People who have a disability, they get ruled out for stupidest reasons because someone's uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, I've only had that experience once in my career. I and maybe I don't know. I think maybe being in America, I've learned to kind of navigate the hiring process. For me, like I said, I know that when you're going into an interview, the things that are going to matter. Either people are going to connect with you based on your race, because we're just humans. That's where our brain is set up. It goes to the thing that's familiar to us. So another person of our race becomes familiar to us. If we have shared interests, or we share the same culture, whatever that is, that happens. And then if I don't mean you don't share the same race, we don't share the same culture, I am left with points of interest. And sometimes in my interview process, I will try to find points of interest with the person interviewing me so they feel like they know me. Because if you don't feel like you know me, you probably are not going to hire me. My brother just had this experience in the Keys. And I was saying to my business partner, I'm like, I think America has really impacted the way I see race and people. So in the Bahamas, we have one culture. Whether you're Black, whether you're brown, whether you're white, we all have one culture. We all speak with the exact same accent. We all eat the exact same food. We listen to the exact same music. It's not like, you know, these people listen to hip hop and these people listen to rock. It's all soca and reggae in the Caribbean. So we all have the same culture. And my brother went down to the Keys and he said he was checking in and he wrote down our surname. And one of the owners was also a Bahamian, but he was a white Bahamian. And so when he saw my brother's last name, he got super excited because another Bahamian had walked in and he hadn't had that experience in forever. And my brother, because we've lived in America so long, he just saw him as a white guy. And this Bahamian comes up to him and he starts talking to him like he's a long lost relative, because that's what Caribbean people do. Like the minute you meet another one, you just start talking. And he was embarrassed because he had fallen into this American idea of, well, I'm Black, he's white, so therefore what's going on here? And in having that conversation, he was like, what am I doing? We're Bahamians. This is how we normally interact with one another. We never paid attention to who was Black or who was white. We were just all Bahamians. And so I think we all have these built-in biases, but we have to give space. In your case, where if an Indian employee walks in or an Indian candidate walk in, there's a point of familiarity, but you don't let that be your decision making for hiring that person.
No, I hate when people try to use that.
Yeah. And the same way for me, like I will say, if a Black person walks in, I already feel like I know them, but then it's on my job. It's my job to dig
But I
in.
want to interject for a second. I want to correct you. When an Indian person walks in, actually, I've never ever felt, maybe because growing up, I had all types of friends in high school, anyways. Growing up, but I remember my friends in high school more than any other group. We used to call ourselves the multicultural table. So our table of friends, we were all from different races, while other tables were like Italians, Philippine, Indian, whatever, right? But our table wasn't like that. So we used to joke and be like, we're the multicultural table. Anybody's welcome to sit with us, kind of thing. So maybe because I had that experience for such a long time, that when I don't see color, I don't automatically gravitate towards Indian people. I don't. To me, everyone's the same. So I don't think that I have common things with Indian people, because growing up, I grew up with such diverse cultures as friends that I learned their culture. And to me, that's a normal. So I gravitate towards anyone. So I've actually, I guess it's a good thing. I've never, ever saw someone come in.
Than the rest of us, Gurpreet.
Yeah, but I guess I am fortunate that I had that experience, that I had diverse friends, and that's my upbringing, because I got to learn all these different cultures. You create like such a young age that's instilled me. So when I see candidates, I'm okay with white, I'm okay with Black people, I have Black friends, I have white friends, I grew up around these people, you understand them. So I don't. So my friend and I was talking about this conversation. So she grew up opposite from me, all Indian people. Her neighborhood was like that. So she had many people that more in common. Me had an opposite experience. I had diverse friends. So I think it could also come down to stem from maybe how you were like growing up. Who was your friends?
There's also other factors, because I know for me as a Jewish person, I find there's generally one of two responses from other Jewish people in the business world. There's the Jewish people that want to dig in on that and commiserate with me over the fact that we're both Jewish and will drop comments in every chance they get.
Right.
And then there's another group of people that, based on their own experiences, don't like to talk about religion and their own religion at work, and would be mortified if I even mentioned the fact that we're both Jewish, that they actively avoid that conversation. And so it's very interesting, because, I mean, we all come from our different places. So for you, Gurpreet, you had, this multicultural, like friends growing up. So for you, you see it a certain way. You see anybody who walks in could be your friend, right? That's the way you see it. Because of me, I'm hyper conscious of my biases. And because of that, whenever I was hiring, I always made sure that, okay, I'm aware of whatever initial reaction is, but I have to remove that. And I have to just get to the heart of, this is a human being, wherever they are, wherever they're from, whatever they look like, there's a human being on the other side. And that's really the heart of what I wanted to get at. We've run a little bit over, which is okay, because we had to start a little bit late, technical difficulties. Thank you everybody for sticking with us. Tammy, do you want to give us just a couple of sentences just to really sum this all up? Because, Gurpreet and I always love having you on as a guest.
And I just love
the offline conversations.
I know it's the best. The offline conversations are really, really good. So what I want to say for those of the people who kind of hung with us is that, one, understanding that you do have biases, and it's okay to talk through your biases. The problem comes when we show up in workspaces, whether we are the managers or the employees, thinking we have none, because that's dangerous. Because if you don't think you have anything to work on, then where do you go from there? So I think it's being honest about what your biases are. And so your bias may not be race, but it may be religion. It may be ethnicity. It may be culture. You may show up with some form. It may be education, like Gurpreet was saying at the beginning of this. So you only want MBA people because you have an MBA. So just being aware of what your biases are and being honest about them, so then you can then talk through them. Second is, don't just hire people for race. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. You're going to be creating more problems than the problem you think you're solving by hiring somebody just based on their race, because you don't want to, make it impossible for them to do their job, because people from other races will only assume that they have the job because of their race. And lastly, in order to change any organization and in order to really get at the heart of diversity and inclusion, you have to be willing to have hard conversations. And hard conversations are designed to make you uncomfortable. So if you're uncomfortable, you're probably having the right conversation. If you walk into a conference room and everybody walks out feeling just as great as they came in, I promise you, you didn't have the conversation you should have been having.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tammy. Always a pleasure having you as a guest. Gil, do you have any ending remarks? Me and Tammy are like,
I'm so grateful for Tammy to take the time to come and join us. This is a really important conversation. Since DE&I has been thrust into the spotlight over the last 4 months, as it's become buzzwordified, there's a lot of risk of it going in the wrong direction. There's a lot of risk of people doing damage in the conversations they're having. And so the first thing is to start by just acknowledging that these need to be difficult conversations. But that's the only way we get to somewhere better, because this comes from a place that, this is just my own perception here, but we come from a history that some people have been just much more comfortable at the expense of others.
Yeah.
And the reality is the people who have been comfortable need to walk through this discomfort so that we can all get to a better place.
Well said. Well said.
My last ending remarks is, don't aim to be perfect. There's no such thing as perfect. We are human beings. As a company, you need to be work in progress. But need to really start with, as both Gil and Tammy said, with those difficult conversations are must needed conversations to have before you hire, even for DNI. Anybody you hire going forward, really take that hard look at your organization to make sure there's no biases happening. Again, I love what Tammy said. We're human beings. We naturally have some biases. Just recognize that and work towards improving it so that you're eliminating those biases and not creating the biases happening. So on that note, we're going to end. We'll be back Thursday with another great topic. Stay tuned. We'll probably announce it once we have a confirmation of a topic. Sometimes topics just fall in. Like me and Tammy were having a conversation, and Tammy, you need to have me again on your show. I was like, sure, come. Like, what we're going to talk about. So great. Hey, if anybody wants to come on the show with me and Gil to talk on any organizational things, feel free to reach out to me and Gil directly. We're open to having guests on Thursdays, so feel free to reach out to us. In the meantime, keep healthy, safe, have fun. We'll be back next week. Bye, guys.
Bye.